Hello. This is now week 5 of our module, TMM2051, New Testament Studies, and we're looking at the last of our John's Gospel sessions. And this week we're looking at John's Passion. And this won't be a terribly long video, not like last week where we almost hit an hour. What we'll do is we'll have a look at John's structure. We'll mention a few themes. I've got a book that I want to mention to you, not because I want you to go out and buy it, but just because it's good for you to know where the reference is coming from. And this is a book called Jewish Messianism and the Cult of Christ by William Horbury. And I'll be referring to that in the middle of the session. So I'm just going to put on our screen now why that says lecture 7, I have no idea. I'm just going to put on the screen the narrative structure of John that I used in a previous video. And as we can see, we've got the book of John broken up into 4 main sections. We've got the prologue, we've got the book of signs, which is ministry and teaching, which contains the 7 signs that we have mentioned so far. Then we've got the book of glory, which begins in chapter 13 and includes final teaching, passion and resurrection. Of course, if we were to represent John's narrative structure diagrammatically, like we did in a previous session, what we'd probably have is we'd have those 3 blocks with a 4th layer beginning at the book of signs and overarching into the book of glory, because of course we have I ams and other discourse material which kind of permeates and peppers this broad narrative structure. And then of course we've got the epilogue, which in some respects is a return to the book of signs, because it concludes in John 20. I'll just scoot forward to that. I should have had this bookmarked. Yes, there we are. John 20 verse 30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. And of course, it may vary. This reads a little bit like an ending. John, in many respects, is like the third Lord of the Rings film book. Third Lord of the Rings film. You think it's about to end, and then there's another chapter or so. And of course, this is what happens. We have something that reads like an ending, and then we have an epilogue. Jesus appears to the 7 disciples, and then Jesus and his final dialogue with Peter. And so there's the basic structure of John's Gospel. Prologue, book of signs, book of glory, epilogue, and then peppered throughout much of the material, there's a layer of discourse material. And we're not speculating in this in this session on what that might say about the composition of John. Rather, we're reading John as a finished literary artifact, which as a finished literary artifact may hint at elements of its composition, but we're not going to be drawing many major inferences about that. So let's have a think about the book of glory. So the book of glory, according to this, begins with John chapter 13 verse 1, but if we think about the passion, the events of the passion narrative in the Synoptic Gospels, we might begin the Passion with the entry into Jerusalem. So think back to the Gospel of Mark, how the Gospel of Mark is, I argued, almost like a play in 3 acts. There's the Galilean ministry, then there's the ministry on the road to Jerusalem, then there's the triumphal entry to the cross. And the triumphal entry is the moment at which the Passion proper begins, because the triumphal entry and the cleansing of the temple is that is the thing which draws Jesus to the attention of both the Romans and the temple hierarchy. And John does this somewhat differently. There is an entry into Jerusalem. It's a triumphal entry. But the cleansing of the temple has already happened chapters before, at the beginning of the Gospel of John. Now, if you've had a chance to read the Raymond Brown text that we've included as part of this week's reading material from the Death of the Messiah, Brown does a very useful comparison of John and the Synoptics and points out, quite rightly, that there's a substantial changing of order. And of course, the triumphal entry and the cleansing of the temple can't be the occasion for the crucifixion in John's Gospel. And arguably that's what the death of Lazarus does. So the death of Lazarus is a thing that is one of the things that provokes the opposition becoming a crisis. So we'll begin with the entry into Jerusalem, but then we'll scoot forward to John chapter 13. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to whistle through the materials. But what I'd like us to think about is something that William Horbury talks about in relation to Jewish messianism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Christology, or theories of what it is to be the Messiah. According to Horbury, I'm going to take this off screen, put you back onto the main camera. According to Horbury, there are a number of messianic prototypes. And these are images in the Old Testament and in Jewish literature generally that become incorporated into theories of what the Messiah's job is and who he is and what he's like. And according to Horbury, the first of the messianic prototypes is Moses, the leader of the people, the one who liberates, the one who takes through the Exodus, the one who performs mighty signs, the one who does miraculous feedings and waterings, the one who leads them to the boundaries of the promised land. And it's really interesting when we look at the bread of life discourse, for instance, in John, that one of the questions of the crowd is, surely this is the prophet that was to come into the world. And they were about to make him king by force. The idea there being the prophet who was to come was a reference to Moses saying to the Israelites, God will send you a prophet like me. And there are examples from various midrashes and Talmud and Talmudic passages that talk about the Messiah when he comes will do bread miracles in the desert, like Moses. So the idea. So even though John begins with a contrast between Jesus Christ and Moses, the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth through Jesus Christ. Once again, we're invited to compare as well as contrast. That John creates a resonance in order to say, well, Jesus is like this but different, or Jesus is like this but more. And there might be elements of that with John and Moses. There's also the reference to David. David, and particularly the experience of David as king, is a key figure for all of the gospel writers. It crops up in different ways in the Passion. So, for instance, in St. Mark's Passion, the words of Jesus on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's a direct quotation from Psalm 22, which is attributed to David. And so it's very difficult not to read Mark's Passion as being framed, at least in part, around Jesus achieving his kingdom by means of opposition that sums up and goes beyond the opposition that David, in achieving his kingdom, received. Be interesting to see when we look at John's Passion whether there are any David materials there, and that's going to be interesting. Then there's also the servant of Isaiah 53. So if we think about Isaiah 53, that lovely passage that talks about him like a sheep before his shearers being silent, he opens not his mouth. And particularly the idea of the servant of the Lord suffering on behalf of the people. Now, there's a really interesting question there about what's the meaning of suffering in the different Gospels. What's the meaning of suffering in the different Gospels? And finally, then there's also the smitten shepherd of Zechariah 13. And this is the shepherd who enters Jerusalem lowly, riding on a donkey, who is betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. It's clear at some level that in some Gospels that the narrative is framed around framed around the fulfillment of certain prophetic passages like Zechariah, so much so that in some gospel passages, for instance in Matthew's description of the triumphal entry, the events are explicitly conformed so that they're more proximate to the biblical passage. So in Mark's triumphal entry, Jesus enters on one colt. In Matthew's triumphal entry, there's two. And if you can always tell whether when you look at stained glass windows or iconography, whether you're looking at Mark's triumphal entry or Matthew's. Because in Mark's triumphal entry, Jesus is sitting on one donkey. In Matthew's triumphal entry, he's sitting on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so in the picture, you have a picture of a donkey with Jesus on it, and then a tiny little donkey footstool that kind of trots along beside him. In many respects, this is St. Matthew conforming the events that he's recounting from Mark so that they're more proximate, so they more accurately echo the language of the prophetic texts. And so the triumphal entry is one of those. The betrayal of Jesus is one of those. And it'll be interesting to consider how all of these themes, what volume they have. And I think volume is a good metaphor there. We'll talk about that in a moment. And also what their prominence is. We ought to think about the Passion narrative as a moment at which, as the culmination of the ministry and the life of Jesus, and the particular death was one of those moments in a range of ancient literature that revealed the truth of someone's life. If you ever read the death of Socrates and Plato, this is the moment at which Socrates' teaching is seen by Plato as being, truly and wholly and tragically enacted. And likewise in the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, the death of Jesus is seen as being, in many respects, the culmination of the meaning of his life and ministry. And so what you would expect to find is that if there are differences of emphasis across the Gospels, they would be particularly apparent in the distinctive mix and emphases of the Passion, in the way in which different themes and images interact. And we'll have a think about that in relation to John. And then finally, there's the reference to the Son of Man in Daniel 7. And in some Gospels, this is obviously alluded to in the trial narrative. Because, of course, it's the quotation from Daniel that gets Jesus into hot water with the high priest. Forgive me, I'm going to ignore that telephone. Brilliant. That's it's been picked up elsewhere. What was I saying? Yes, the Son of Man. It's quotation from Daniel that gets Jesus crucified, condemned in Matthew and Mark. Think about it. Are you the Son? Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And in Mark, I am. Not a Johannine, I am, by the way. In Mark, I am, and then quotes from Daniel, or rather alludes to Daniel. It's a modified quotation. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. Of course, in Daniel, the Son of Man isn't seated. It's only God, the Ancient of Days, that sits. The Son of Man stands in the presence of God. That might have been one element that led to that particular response being so offensive. Similarly, in Matthew, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Well, you're saying that, sou leges, but nevertheless, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. Same quotation, same modification. Interestingly, by the time you get to Stephen's martyrdom, where the same idea is alluded to in Acts, Jesus, the Son of Man, is standing at the right hand of power. Nevertheless, be interesting to think about Son of Man imagery in the Passion and whether it crops up in John. And so we've got 5 figures. We've got David, Moses, the smitten shepherd, the Son of Man, and the suffering servant. And Horbury is quite correct to point out that these are principal images for constructing a messianic theology. But of course, we ought to think, this is my suggestion, we ought to think about these things as not discrete images when they are combined and brought together in differing proportions in the works of different writers. You get messianisms of different flavour. And there are lots of different ways you can think about this. But one of the things I'd like us to think about is that when we bring 2 different things together, the resultant effect is often different. It's often a third thing. So Jesus isn't reducible, or the Messiah isn't reducible to any one of those images. And the images acquire a different set of resonances when they're combined with other images. It's rather like if you were to get a rock cake or a Victoria sandwich cake. It would be a job of work to try and break it down into its component parts, because the act of combining it and then cooking it has turned it into something different. An alternative way of thinking about this would be to think about each one of these messianic images as a musical theme. And of course, when we combine musical themes into polyphonous compositions, the overall effect is such that the composition in its totality exceeds what the sum of the different themes might be doing. Bitter-sweetness, for instance, isn't simply the combination of bitterness and sweetness. It's a distinct third thing that emerges out of the interaction between these things. And that's how we ought to think, I think, about Christology, and particularly the theological art that goes into building a picture of Jesus, and particularly a picture of Jesus through the stories of the Passion. And so what we might find that one of the distinctive things about the Johannine Passion is the way in which certain things are emphasised and de-emphasised, even though they're present. So we can look at, for instance, Mark's Passion and see that the Zechariah suffering smitten shepherd is there. How's it there? Well, it's there in the triumphal entry. It's there in the betrayal of Judas. That the suffering servant is there. How's it there? Well, it's there in the trial. He refused to answer, even though they falsely accused him. The experience of David is there. He's anointed by the woman. He quotes David from the cross. Moses is there. Now, where's the Moses there? Well, for all of the early Christians, Jesus is the great liberator, and here he's the great liberator in giving his disciples food for the journey in the form of the Last Supper. Do this in remembrance of me. And then finally, where's the Son of Man? Well, we've quoted the Son of Man at the trial, but there's also, beyond the crucifixion, there's the resurrection. And actually one of the distinctive jobs of the Son of Man in the Danielic literature was that he would be God's agent of confrontation with the empires of the world. And of course, what's going on there in the trial narrative, in Herod, in the passing to Pilate, in being crucified by the Roman soldiers. There's quite a distinctive combination of images and themes, and if we were to regard the Passion narrative in, say, Mark as polyphonous, we'd get one particular set of thematic emphases that arise out of the presentation of the story. I would argue that the words on the cross loom very large, and that if we were building a Christology from the Gospel of Mark alone, there'd be a strong sense of Jesus reaching his glory by passing through utter desolation. My God, why have you forsaken me? And there'd also be a lot of representative suffering in the form of the trial narrative. And that would be one particular set. In John, well, what are the themes that are at play in John? I might argue that if the prologue overshadows the whole of John, there would be a stateliness, a kind of slow dignity to John's passion, where Jesus, as the Logos, it might look like he's out of control. It might look like he's being tried. It might look as though he's the object of other people's actions. Yet, one of the things that we would look at in the light of both the theology of the prologue and the literary irony that this theology provokes, one of the things that we might do when we're examining the Passion in John is look for those moments where Jesus is utterly in control. Absolutely in control. And so we might think about Gethsemane. We might think about Pilate's fear in his trial with Pilate. We might think about how, my God, why have you forsaken me, becomes, I lay down my life only to take it up again. It is finished. And we might even think about how the Son of God isn't so much abandoned as dismissing. Think about how in Mark all the disciples flee, and only the women watch the crucifixion from the distance. But in John, you've got that interaction at the foot of the cross, where Jesus gives his mother to John's care, to the beloved disciples' care. That feels more in control. It feels less abandoned. It feels different. And yet, one rather suspects that the same themes are at play. And so what we're dealing with here is not the presence or absence of certain images in John's Gospel and its passion, but rather a particular kind of thematic theological artistry that emerges in large part out of John's Logos theology, and which gives quite a distinctive feel to John's Passion. So let's have a quick look at John's Passion. So I'm going to try and bring that up on the screen. Let's have a look. Need to make sure I go back to the triumphal entry. And this will really be quite a rapid survey. Okay, so I'm going to put that on the screen. We've got the anointing at the beginning of chapter 12. Almost as John does this quite a lot, there's a foreshadowing. And all the gospel writers do this because that's good literary art. I'm recording this in the week after Candlemas, and Luke beautifully foreshadows the crucifixion in Simeon's address to Mary. A sword will pierce your own soul too. But here we've got a shadow of what is to come. Judas, why was this perfume not sold and the money given to the poor? And he didn't do this because he cared about the poor, because he was a thief. And then this becomes an occasion for Jesus to reference his burial, and to reference the fact that he's not always going to be there. And that not always going to be there is key to John's soteriology. Jesus comes, does what he needs to do, goes back to the Father, but he does that so that the Holy Spirit might come. And this is part of the discourse material in this section of John. And so John's distinctive emphasis is on what will life be like when Jesus is gone, and Jesus is foreshadowing that. The plot to kill Lazarus. The priests planned to put Lazarus to death because he became an occasion for the Jews believing in Jesus. But then we have the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And you have the same body of Old Testament texts that are alluded to in the Synoptic Gospels. Your king is coming sitting on a donkey's colt. Again, more overshadowing. The disciples don't understand things at first. But when Jesus was glorified, they remembered that these things had been written. The crowd is not just a random crowd, it's the crowd that saw Lazarus raised from the dead. This is why the sign of Lazarus is so intrinsically bound up with the provocation of the Passion. And then the Pharisees, look, the world has gone out after him. And this is an oblique echoing of something that Jesus himself says in John chapter 3 about the Son of Man being lifted up, and when he's lifted up, he will draw all men to him. As if to illustrate the Pharisees' point, some Greeks wish to see Jesus. So we wish to see Jesus. And this is the provocation for Jesus, saying the hour has come. And this is interesting. His hour hasn't come in chapter 2 when he does the wedding, the sign at Cana. At various points in John he says the hour is coming and has now come. Here it's the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. The moment. This is the eschatological moment. And so Jesus is acclaimed by the Gentiles before the Passion. The Gentiles coming to him in response, largely in fulfillment, largely of Jesus' own prediction that he would draw all people, and the Pharisees' objection that the whole world has gone after him, becomes an occasion for Jesus to speak about his death. And this is a distinctive moment because in John, the death of Jesus is the distinctive vehicle for his glorification. Now, it's worth, I'm going to take this off share for a moment. It's worth saying that John is by no means the only New Testament writer that has an ironic view of the crucifixion. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul talks about the crucifixion, the cross being the foolishness of God, which is wiser than the world. There's certainly an element of ironic reversal in that. You know, you powers thought that you were doing this, you've ended up doing that and actually bringing yourselves down. There's a similar sort of ironic reversal implied in some Roman stories of crucifixion. Now, I can't quite remember exactly what document I read this in, but there's a scholar called Joel Marcus who wrote an essay a while ago entitled Crucifixion as Paradoxical Glorification or Paradoxical Exaltation. I'm speaking from memory here. And I remember Professor Marcus recounting the story of a Roman who, because he was a free-born Roman, was entitled to be executed not by crucifixion but by the sword, and he insisted that he was given the death that befits his status. So he was ironically crucified on a cross that was much higher than everybody else's. The point being that crucifixion as a form of degradation was laden with all sorts of ironic reversals. You elevate somebody in order that everybody can see their shame. You raise them up in order to bring them down. And what seems to be at play in at least some early Christian responses to the crucifixion is that the powers thought that they were doing that to Jesus, but actually an even bigger ironic reversal was going on. And so if we think about the cross from the perspective of the Romans, it's an ironic reversal. You elevate in order to display the degradation. You raise up in order to put down. For John, the moment at which the Son of Man is put down by being lifted up, ironically, it's a kind of super irony there. That's the moment of his glorification. That's the moment at which he does the work, the distinctive work of the Father, and displays something of the truth of his glory. And it's also worth bearing in mind, and I'll put you back on to share screen, that this moment of judgment of the world involves the ruler of this world being driven out. Again, when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. So when Jesus refers to the snake being lifted up in the wilderness, it's echoed here. I am lifted up from the earth. And we're supposed to be attuned to the irony of is his lifting up from the earth wisdom returning to the heavenly places, or is his lifting up from the earth the moment of his crucifixion? And verse 33, the fact that this is explained is, I think, an indication that there's a definite double meaning there. We're supposed to hear, when I go back to the Father, I will draw all people to myself. And then for us to actually realise that it's the moment of crucifixion that does the drawing. The reference to the Son of Man. We're already into Danielic messianic prototypes. So anyway, let's scoot forward. Interestingly, there is no institution narrative in the Gospel of John. There's no giving of the Lord's Supper and command that you do it in remembrance of me. There is the washing of the disciples' feet. Now, this is interesting. There's all sorts of things that we might make of that. Is that because John is downplaying sacramentality, or is that because John is upplaying sacramentality, because the position that was occupied by the institution narrative in the Synoptic Gospels is theologically occupied by the bread of life discourse and the feeding miracle? A real interesting question there. There's another betrayal prediction. Before we do that, let me just have a quick look. Where's it at? Yes, let me just quickly put this in a different version, and let's see. Oh. That'll do. Right, so that was John. Yes. This is just a tiny little historical tidbit that you might be interested in, and I just saw it as we passed. But just when we're interpreting artworks about the Last Supper, you'll often see John as a young man with his head on Jesus' chest, and you can see this in John chapter 13:25. He then, lying on Jesus' breast, saith unto him, Lord, who is it? So what you've got is Simon saying saying to John, saying to Jesus, and John's got his head on Jesus' chest. I think the NRSV translates this much better. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? What you need to imagine in the ancient world is a dining room where everybody's reclining on couches, lying on their left side, using their right hand to feed themselves. Because of course, like a lot of Near Eastern countries, you eat with your right hand because you use your left hand for unspeakable things. And so you're lying on your left side, eating with your right, and because the rooms wouldn't be vast, you'd be at quite close quarters, and the person to your right, his head would be basically quite near to your chest. That picture isn't what Leonardo da Vinci is painting, because he's got them all sat at a table on chairs instead of reclining on couches around a low table. One thing that we should notice, though, is that by positioning the disciple whom Jesus loves as at the immediate right hand of the host, that shows him, that's putting him in the place of particular honour. And so there's a real interesting tidbit there that we wouldn't have picked up if we didn't know something about the architecture of ancient meals and the seat and how they sat at table, and so basically John doesn't have his head on Jesus' chest; he's to Jesus' immediate right. But the fact that he's at Jesus' immediate right is significant for John's understanding of the relative importance of the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's his favourite. Favourite's the wrong word, but that's the one. That's the one who has the position of great honour, not Peter. But anyway, that's an aside. We've then got new commandments, Peter's denial, common themes, and then quite a substantial discourse about Jesus as the way to the Father, the true vine, the work of the Spirit, how Jesus going away will be followed by a period of joy, and peace for the disciples. So if we scoot past that and go straight to the betrayal and arrest of Jesus, one of the things that we can see is that Jesus is totally in charge of his own arrest. We've looked, when we did I am, at the ego eimi in John chapter 18 verse 6, when Jesus said to them I am, they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, whom are you looking for? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said, I told you, I am. And you notice there's three I ams. I am he, I am he. I told you that I am he. There's a threefold reference there. Think about Isaiah chapter 6. The cherubim are saying the Trisagion, holy, holy, holy. The one who was, the one who is to come. There's a real interesting threefold play there. But the most important thing is that they've come to take him, and they can't take him. He goes with them. In other words, the crucifixion isn't something that happens to Jesus. It's something that he chooses. And so there is no extended Gethsemane prayer, take this cup from me. He knows all that's going to happen. And he came forward and asked, who are you looking for? That's a big contrast. It's a big contrast. We go to Jesus and the high priest. The disciples don't disappear. Peter and another disciple follow. You have the high priest's questions. Nothing about the temple. Nothing about the temple. I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and temples. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said. They know what I said. And then off he goes from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. So what's interesting is there is no dramatic confrontation between Jesus and the high priest, where he quotes Daniel at the high priest and says, you are going to see the Son of Man coming on the right hand of power, seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. So in other words, you're numbered with the pagan empires that the Son of Man has come to destroy. Nothing like that. We might, at the one level, take that as, is John downplaying the Son of Man theme in the Christological traditions, in the Passion traditions? Is Son of Man less important for John? Well, no, because we've had the Son of Man being lifted up just before. He might be doing something slightly different. So let's have a look at Pilate. Are you the King of the Jews? Now, this is interesting. In Jesus' answer, cryptic response. Do you ask this on your own? So you are a king. Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. Pilate asked him, what is truth? This is the moment. This is the moment at which Jesus is revealed. It's almost as if the high priests are being discounted, that this is the moment at which which Jesus actually has the moment of confrontation with the representation of empire. My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. The Son of Man is the one who brings the everlasting kingdom. So it's almost as if the Son of Man theme has been taken out of the high priest trial and inserted into the or expanded in the conversation with Pilate. It's in the conversation with Pilate that Jesus as Son of Man becomes especially visible. This is the moment at which the kingdom, the one who brings the kingdom of God, the everlasting kingdom which replaces the kingdoms of the Gentiles, this is the moment at which the representative of the beasts and the representative of the Ancient of Days come face to face. And what's really interesting about this story is that the representative of the beasts, the beastly kingdoms, doesn't understand what's happening. That's the fascinating thing about this interaction between Jesus and Pilate. Pilate asked him what is truth. It's not a philosophical question. He's not parking Jesus somewhere. He genuinely doesn't understand. He can find no case against him. He can find no case against him, but he doesn't understand what's happening. Doesn't see this as an eschatological confrontation. And so the really interesting thing is that you've got an interesting play, I think, on the power yet ignorance of Pilate and the impotence yet knowing wickedness of the priests. There's a real interaction there. And this is some interesting literary and theological art that's going on here. The scourging. Now, the scourging occurs alongside Jesus' silence. Look at verse 8. He's scourged by the soldiers. And what we're supposed to do from the perspective of the ironic theology of the prologue, the ironic literary art that's provoked by the theology of the prologue, we're supposed to see the scourging as an ironic affirmation of Jesus' messiahship. He is the King of the Jews. They don't know what they're doing. And then the silence of Jesus in verse 8. Pilate was afraid of the crowd. He asks Jesus more questions, but at this point, Jesus is just silent. And at this point, what you've got messianic kingship interspersed with Davidic struggle, interspersed with Isaiah 53. Like a sheep before its shearers is silent, he opens not his mouth. And then we have a look at the crucifixion of Jesus, and it's worth saying that Psalm 22 may not be on the lips of Jesus as he's crucified. It may not be on the lips of Jesus as he's crucified, but it's there. They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots, and that's what the soldiers did. I think that if we look carefully, we can see most, if not all, of the same messianic themes that you see in the other Passion narratives in an interplay in the Gospel of John. It's just he's doing something different with them. And the overarching theology is shaped differently. We might even apply Johannine irony to "it is finished." It is over, it is complete, or it is fulfilled. The point being that what's distinctive about John's Passion isn't so much what he has Jesus do and say, although there are very distinctive emphases there, like the way in which Jesus drives the narrative forward in the garden, like the way in which he drives the narrative forward with Pilate. But what's interesting is I think the way in which this event is laden with a different sort of Christological significance, that the prologue and the theology of the signs rather frames how the Passion fulfills the life and ministry of Jesus. And here, what that then means is, it means that, let's think of the right way of saying it, that the crucifixion is far closer to the centre of the meaning of John's soteriology as a standalone event almost. Jesus lays down his life and only to take it up again, whereas crucifixion and resurrection are bound together. Whereas for John, the crucifixion is that supreme moment of paradox, that moment where the source of life dies, where glory is humiliated only to achieve a greater glory, where the Son of Man, in being elevated in order to be debased, is raised to the glory of the Father, where life lays down itself only in order to take it up again. And of course, in all the other Gospels and in all the rest of the New Testament materials, Jesus is raised by God, whereas in the Johannine tradition, he lays down his life for him to take it up again. And so crucifixion stands alone, I think, in John's Gospel as that particular moment of paradox and ironic reversal. That isn't to say that John downplays the resurrection. Rather, the resurrection is the means by which the Son of God might go in return to the Father and send the Holy Spirit. But even that is experienced in advance by the disciples after the resurrection, when Jesus breathes on them. They don't have to wait until he's enthroned in heaven. Rather, he has received all that he possibly could receive, even at that moment, pre-exaltation. And that's because for John, the moment of exaltation is the crucifixion, that moment of supreme sacrifice. And John's crucifixion theology is deeply, deeply shaped around the idea of the sacrifice. So a difference in mood, a difference in thematic interplay, not necessarily John saying something that wouldn't be recognised as covering all of the bases by the other gospel writers. He still thinks about messianism through the lens of the Messiah, when he comes, will fulfill Moses, fulfill David, fulfill Zechariah, fulfill Isaiah, and fulfill Daniel's Son of Man. So anyway, I hope that gives you a sense of what's going on in the Passion narratives. And one last comment. I've included a very lengthy extension activity for those that want to do it, precisely because I think that the image of musical themes interplaying is a really useful interpretative analogy when we think about what's going on in the different Gospels. And so I've included a video of Bach's St. John's Passion, performed by the Netherlands Bach Society. And one of the things that you might hear in that piece is precisely this. Well, the only way I can describe it is more than any of the others. St. John's Passion evokes for me that hymn by Isaac Watts, When I Survey. See from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Could e'er such love and sorrow meet, or love compose so rich a crown? Thorns compose so rich a crown. The stateliness and kingliness of John's Jesus is given theological depth in the Passion, when kingliness and the Logos come together and do something really quite remarkable with the narrative. I've done it again. We've gone over, but I rather get excited when I'm talking about John. So I hope to see you on Wednesday. I hope you enjoy this video, and if you've got any thoughts or comments, please make a note of them and we'll share them at the seminar. God bless. Take care.